Welcome to MarsCast, the official podcast of Mid-America Reformed Seminary, where faculty and friends explore the depths of faith, unpack biblical truth, and engage with the critical issues of our time. I'm Jared Luchabor. Thanks for tuning in. What books should aspiring seminary students read to prepare for their theological education? Well, in this episode from the archives, Dr. J. Mark Beach and Dr. Andrew Compton discuss recommended reading for future seminarians, from foundational works like Machen's Christianity and Liberalism to comprehensive Bible surveys. They share personal experiences with influential books that shape their own theological journeys and offer practical advice about building a theological library on a budget. Check it out.
You know, this is it's kind of an interesting topic, especially for students who are thinking about seminary, preparing for seminary. And you know, here at Mid-America, we have recommended reading, things we encourage students to read through before they start their studies, because we think that'll help their studies. But we also recognize there's limits. You come to seminary to learn. So a few things we can talk about on that. I mean, I found reading some books before seminary to be really valuable. But it didn't suddenly make a substitute for my learning. I don't know if you found something similar.
Well, my first theological book that was what I consider a real theological book was John Gresham Machen's Christianity and Liberalism.
Oh, sure, sure.
It was a strange book to begin with because, you know, he's really engaged in the polemics against the modernism he faced. But my father actually gave me that book and said I should read it. I'm not sure it was the best recommendation for someone starting out in their theological journey. I guess he wanted to protect me against theological liberal. Yes, he wanted to shore that up right away. But then the next book I read was also from Machen, Christian Faith in the Modern World, which is sort of a primer in basic Christian doctrine. At least it has those features. And I think the budding theological student, depending on what kind of background they've had and what kind of baccalaureate experience they've had, should seek to prepare for seminary by reading good books. And books are kind of a tool bag. You don't use every book all the time, but eventually you need that book and you need to go back to that book because books are power. I mean, they give you knowledge and strength and ideas, and they inform and teach. So, yeah, preachers tend to be hopefully about people, but also about books.
Yeah. You can love people and yet have very little to say to them because you haven't learned much.
Yeah, well, even Paul, needed those scrolls.
Yeah.
So, there's our biblical defense for
Right.
books. Paul needed the scrolls.
We say to our wives, honey, look, I know this bill looks big, but...
Yeah, probably right away you ought to say to the budding theological student, and for pastors who haven't learned this already, you need to have a book budget.
Yeah.
And you need to be agreed with your wife what sort of funds are going to be diverted that way, and keep within budget. For a time in my ministry, I was in debt to, I would say I'm in debt to my wife because I had overspent on books and I had to pay my bill down to her.
Yeah, I came into ministry from another career. I mean, my college training was in music education, and I taught band and orchestra for several years before seminary. So I had a humanities education, but to be honest, I think I spent most of my college grudgingly doing all my other classes and just focusing on playing my trumpet. And so I did have a lot to learn, and so I found a lot of books really good at getting me thinking like a theologian and getting me used to reading books about the Bible and books about theology, rather than just hearing it at a popular level. Because one of those things that sort of drew me into studying the Bible more deeply and wanting to pursue the ministry was listening to people and a desire to teach. But I was listening to radio preachers, and good ones. I wasn't listening to the really corny ones. But to get to that point where you can teach, there's things that you need to learn, and so it helped me. I mean, I read a lot of R.C. Sproul. I remember reading Machen, I think from a reference of Sproul, maybe that he made, Christianity and Liberalism. And that was a time when I didn't actually realize that Presbyterians were kind of on the same team as the Reformed. That's how green I was.
Oh, yeah.
And I went, oh, they're Reformed too. Oh, what's this Westminster Confession of Faith? Wow, this is fabulous. So...
Well, books are the theological books and books surrounding the study of theology. As I said earlier, they equip, they empower, they inform, and they're tools that you carry with you onward, forward. A carpenter needs his power saw and power drill and chisel and hammer and all the tools of the trade. He really can't do without them. And to think that you can read a book, there it's filed away. I know, I gleaned what I could, I'm finished. There's some books that perhaps were not worth reading, but there's a lot of books that even if you didn't agree with many points, had good things. And if you read well, you'll mark a book well so you can recover what you need to find again in a book. So I guess this episode we're pro books.
Yeah, here. Well, there's maybe one way we can even approach this is talking through just some things that we found in our respective fields that we kind of either found valuable to ourselves, or we kind of in observing students as they come in, wish some of these students had read because we see how it would have benefited them, or even students maybe who had read some of these, we saw how it did benefit them, how it helped them, and how they had something of a leg up. So it seems like we can talk through just some different books that we recommend for a variety of reasons. And again, all of this is not to say that in order to come to seminary you have to have it all together. That's the whole point of coming to seminary, is to learn. And yet, here is a way you can begin to test the waters, as it were. Where should we start? Where's sort of some of the best foundation-laying things that you would recommend?
Well, I think, when you start talking about seminary preparation and books to get you ready, on the one hand, there's going to be textbooks that you'll read in seminary, but having read that textbook before, making your way through it, maybe not understanding near as much as you think you do, and then coming at the book again when you're in seminary, you'll grasp the whole argument and the main features, the main points much better. But then there's books that, perhaps you're not going to ever be assigned in seminary, but would greatly benefit your coming to seminary, having a foundation laid. So I think you could, on the one hand, divide it between biblical studies of different sorts, things that are oriented to hermeneutics and study of Old and New Testament. There's that dealing more with theology and church history and history of dogma, and kind of the philosophical undergirding a foundation to help you understand some of those discussions. That'd be my biggest broad. Obviously, there's ministerial studies too.
Sure.
But you certainly don't want students coming to seminary thinking that they already understand pastoral care and counseling and preaching.
Or that they can even really meaningfully engage in those pastoral studies without a theological and biblical foundation.
Exactly.
Because that can feel so sensible. Well, I love other people.
Right.
Maybe somebody even was serving in some leadership capacity at a church, and they were engaged in very hands-on kinds of things. And that's not to minimize their effectiveness or downplay the efforts they put into that, or how many people they certainly blessed, but it is to say, here we're grounding those very things in our biblical and theological studies. We're cinching the whole bundle up.
Yeah. Well, speaking of that, tell us, what are some books, especially in the biblical studies dimension, that you would recommend that a student perhaps has consumed, so that when he comes to seminary, he's better prepared.
Yeah. Well, one of them is obviously knowing the contents of the Bible. And that's
Oh, you're suggesting people read the Bible. Oh,
we did have a Reformation that enabled us to get copies in our own language. But yeah, but to, not only reading through and reading through books, to read through some of the larger books like Isaiah in a few sittings to really get a sense of the contents and then the flow of biblical books. That so crucial. Of course, we become lifelong students of Scripture, but to even have a good background in Bible reading and good habits of Bible reading, and not simply for sort of personal application. We often can approach the Bible very devotionally, and that's beautiful. But to begin to read the Bible with really an eye to what's in this book, how does this book hold together? What are some themes? So there's good study Bibles one can use in doing that. I think of the Reformation Study Bible that has gone through several iterations by Ligonier, or the ESV Study Bible, or the now called the NIV Biblical Theology Study Bible. There's some really good just study Bibles which as you're reading give you notes that can answer some basic questions, and that can really help getting a feel for the contents. Although there's you can sort of begin to probe deeper as is necessary. And I think of some volumes, an older volume that's still been very beneficial is William Hendrickson's Bible Survey.
Oh yes.
Yep. Many a minister preparing for an exam has cut their teeth on Hendrickson, just learning the dates and learning the outlines of books, and it can be a really valuable tool.
I remember that book, working through it, and I was greatly benefited preparing for seminary and being in seminary. Erdman's used to have a book called Erdman's Handbook to the Bible.
Yeah.
Which was beautifully illustrated, gave you a more layman's, a simpler presentation of background history of a book, themes, but it was so well presented. It was almost like YouTube. It fascinated you, and you could spend a whole afternoon in this book.
There are a lot of those handbooks. I remember even a high school textbook. Now that you mention that, I don't know if it was Baker or Erdman's who published it, but yeah, color pictures, little historical tidbits. Just really a fascinating way to start, impressing upon yourself the relative dates and contemporary events and figures. That's the thing. Some of those Bible surveys, regardless of what Christian tradition they're a part of or theological tradition, they can just get down to these nuts and bolts.
What about some meteor books? What do you recommend there?
Yeah, there's even with the surveys, I found even just being able to start to back off. Something that I found really beneficial, still quite popular, is R.C. Sproul and Robert Wohlgemuth's "What's in the Bible," which interestingly is sort of just a transcript of their of Sproul's "Dust to Glory," where that's a video or teaching series. But the nice thing is already now starting to back up a bit and see the storyline of Scripture. And I think that really changed how I thought about the Bible as I was preparing for seminary, is to start thinking about the overarching storyline of Scripture, and also de Graaf's, promise and deliverance. Again, these are still a little more popular. In fact, these books were like a guide for, I think, Sunday school teachers teaching children, and yet really good 30,000-foot view of that overall picture. So it's not just now the contents as sort of like a Jeopardy bunch of trivia questions, but the contents as they fit into the storyline. So those were helpful.
Yeah, C. Vanderwall has a series called Search the Scriptures that do something like de Graaf's Promise and Deliverance. It takes you through all the books of the Bible. It traces themes. I'm not sure if those books are still in print, but some old minister probably has a set of them that they can hand down.
That's always a problem, is some of these great books maybe aren't selling like publishers want them to. And then you can, you hope to find it on Amazon somewhere and not get gouged for it, or find it on a used shelf, or find it from a retired minister who's giving it away. But those are some sort of intro. But I remember being told by my pastor before starting seminary, he said, "You know what? Slog through Louis Berkhof's systematic theology and slog through Gerhardus Voss's biblical theology." And so I dutifully purchased both. Actually, I had Berkhof already, but I picked up Voss and started reading, and I forced my way through because my pastor said it'd be good. And there were some things that really blew my mind, just new ways of thinking about that biblical storyline that I hadn't thought of before, but a whole bunch of stuff that utterly perplexed me. But when I did start seminary and started to hear lectures that assumed so much of this, I kind of had pegs already I could hang my hat on or hang my coat on just from having worked through it. And I've always recommended that students just do their best to plow through Voss. His biblical theology is really a rich treatment of how Scripture unfolds God's revealed truth, how God at separate points in history conveys more about himself, and it's all in connection. It's not as though he's changing course, as even some of our dispensational friends would like to suggest, but we do get a sense of these real differences that exist. And so this is a book I always recommend to students. Read through Voss, and you will be assigned all of the Old Testament portions of Voss here in my courses. I mean, you'll have a chance to rework through them. But Voss also, has his shorter writings, the Redemptive History and Biblical Interpretation, which likewise are some really meaty studies to plow through. And here too, they can be a bit overwhelming if a student hasn't had too much of a biblical and theological training prior to seminary. But here too, a number of studies, some of them more dogmatic and historical. For example, he has an article in here, The Doctrine of the Covenant in Reformed Theology, which is a pretty thick, pretty profound study. But also some broader methodological types of articles. He has an essay called The Idea of Biblical Theology as a Science and as a Theological Discipline. They're two very programmatic in thinking through what is biblical theology. And those things can already start to get students cued into what they're going to be learning in seminary. But then a number of very specific studies in here, some individual studies on the book of Hebrews, or studies on Paul, and he has a thing on the Pauline conception of the Spirit, I think is the name of it. The eschatological aspect of the Pauline conception of the Spirit. You can even tell the titles are pretty hefty in Voss, but it was but again another book that can really start to show some places you'll be going in seminary on the biblical side of things. And I think if I were to add just even two more real hefty ones, the one. Herman Ritterboss's The Coming of the Kingdom. This isn't one I read before seminary. I kind of wish I had, because it made such an impact on me when I finally did in seminary. But it really helped me to think through the role, or that period of history of Jesus' ministry recorded in the Gospels, and how that relates to those later writings, like the epistles. And that later period of history, the period we live in now after the ascension of Christ. And really another one of these kind of biblical theological tour de forces that really grounded me in starting to think about biblical theology, and then the contents of the Bible as they related to these bigger theological questions. And of course, Ritterboss has some other books as well. He's famously known for his Paul book, which I believe Dr. Menninger assigns here. And he has commentary on John. He has several other shorter writings that are very meaty, and yet one who works through them as best as they're able before seminary will sort of have the lay of the land a little more in view.
Thanks for joining us for this discussion about preparing for seminary through reading. We hope these book recommendations and insights will help guide your theological studies, whether you're heading to seminary or simply wanting to grow in your own understanding. Join us next time as Dr. Beach continues his series on Calvin's doctrine of the Christian life, exploring his teaching on self-denial, cross-bearing, and meditation on the future life. We'll examine how Calvin's insights about suffering with patience and finding joy even in difficult providence remain deeply relevant for believers today. Thank you for your continued support of Mid-America Reformed Seminary and this show. Remember to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes, both from our archives and in new discussions. I'm Jared Luchabor. This has been an episode of MarsCast. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.